would like to draw like this, your journey begins here. Hello, I'm Bill Parsons. I have just created a drawing tutorial for you that will teach the style of drawing called rendering. Rendering uses tones and detail to create realistic three-dimensional objects. It's the fastest way to learn how to paint realism since it isolates the tonal aspect of color mixing to focus on learning to see and render tones correctly, which is the essential skill for creating three-dimensional objects. This is a skill that can be learned regardless of your level of talent. The video will be divided into two parts. Part 1 will introduce you to the concepts and skills that you will need to know going forward. Part 2 will give a drawing demonstration of how to use these skills and will explain the concepts in more detail. So let's begin. There's a good reason to begin a lecture on drawing with a comment on color mixing. Color mixing always involves accurately answering the question, how light or dark is the color? When you're mixing colors, each color has to be the correct tone to create three-dimensional shapes and to paint the illusion of light. The tonal scale has 9 tones from light to dark. Each color tone that you mix has to be in the right relation to the other tones. If a green is supposed to be a 4 on the tonal scale and you mix a 2, it will pop out like someone singing off key in a choir. So, just like singing in a choir, the tones of the colors you mix must be in key, called tonal keying. When your tones are off key, your shapes flatten and your light is lost. The fastest way to learn this essential painting skill is to learn to draw with tones, called rendering. This lecture will present the theoretical base for drawing and painting with tones. You will learn to see color as tones, and you will learn to key your tones accurately to create solid three-dimensional shapes and to render light within your canvas that glows as romantic as candlelight and bright as sunlight. All the objects that you draw or paint will be either roundish or squarish. Round objects are either based on a ball or a cylinder. Examples of ball-shaped objects would be a peach, a round vase, or a human shoulder. Cylinder-shaped objects would include a wine bottle, a human forearm, and the trunk of a tree. Squarish objects are based on the box. Paintings of a book, a clenched fist, or the jagged protrusions of a cliff would begin with creating box-like shapes. The human skull is a combination of a box up front with a ball on the back. So when you have learned the secrets of painting boxes, balls, and cylinders using correctly placed and rendered tones, you will have the skills for painting all objects, from a grove of autumn trees on a hillside to the human face in a portrait. Round and square shapes are painted by rendering the sequence of tones that shift from light to dark as the shape turns away from the light. So every tone has a light side that faces the light source and a shadow side that faces away from the light source. The light side consists of 4 tones from light to middle tone, usually rendered as 2 light tones and 2 middle tones. Often, the light side will have a bright, almost white area called the highlight. The highlight is distinguished by a bright core and a slightly darker periphery. The 5th tone following the deepest middle tone is called the shadow edge, a twilight zone that marks the transition from light to shadow. This very important tone will require more explanation later, but for now it is enough to note that shadow edges are only on round objects. From the mysterious shadow edge, we enter the form shadow, which also has 4 tones. The first tone, the shadow accent, is the darkest part of the shadow and usually rendered as a thin, dark line covering the shape of the shadow. Next comes the core shadow tone, slightly lighter than the shadow accent, but darker than the shadow edge. Following the core shadow tone is a warm, luminous area catching light reflected from a nearby object. Called the reflected light, it is slightly lighter at its core and darker at its periphery, just like the highlight. The reflected light blends into the core shadow tone so seamlessly that it sometimes illuminates the shadow like the bright shadows of Peter Paul Rubens. You have just watched part 1 of a tutorial on the concepts and skills necessary for drawing realism. In part 2 of this tutorial, I will apply these techniques to drawing a ball and a cube. As I draw the ball and cube, I will teach in more detail about highlights and shadow edges and all the other tonal concepts I covered in part 1. As we saw in part 1 of this tutorial, mastering these 2 universal shapes are the basis for painting all objects in nature. There is more to learn, so grab your charcoal and paper and let's get started.